At 6:47 on the morning of December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his Sherman tank on a frozen hillside in southeastern Belgium and stared north toward Bastogne. Snow had been falling since midnight. The temperature was 18 degrees below zero. The wind cut through his tanker's jacket like it was paper. His fingers were so cold he could barely feel the binoculars pressed against his face. The town was 5 miles away. Inside it, 10,000 American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded by German forces, running out of ammunition, running out of food, running out of time. They had been trapped for 8 days. The Germans had demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony MacAuliffe had answered with a single word: nuts. That answer had become famous across the Allied armies. It had given hope to soldiers who needed something to believe in during the darkest month of the war. But hope alone could not stop artillery shells. Hope could not feed starving men. Hope could not replace the ammunition that was running out hour by hour. Now Abrams had to get to them. His 37th Tank Battalion had been fighting for 5 straight days through snow, fog, and determined German resistance. They had advanced only 22 miles. 5 more miles stood between them and Bastogne. 5 miles of German paratroopers, anti-tank guns, minefields, and iced roads. 5 miles that might as well have been 1,000. Abrams was 30 years old. He had been in command of the 37th Tank Battalion for over a year. In that time, he had transformed it into something the German army had learned to fear. His men called him Colonel Abe. They followed him because they trusted him. They trusted him because he had never let them down. The Germans called his unit something else entirely. They called them the division that never stopped. The 4th Armored Division had entered combat in France 5 months earlier. Since then, they had accomplished something that seemed statistically impossible. They had killed an estimated 13,600 German soldiers. They had wounded approximately 30,000 more. They had captured over 90,000 prisoners of war, and in all that fighting across all those months, official army records show that only 1 man from the 4th Armored Division remained in enemy captivity at the war's end. While a small number of soldiers were temporarily captured during combat, American counterattacks consistently rescued them before they could be evacuated to German prisoner camps. The division's culture of immediate rescue operations meant that virtually no one stayed a prisoner for long. 1 man in permanent captivity, out of nearly 11,000 soldiers, against an enemy that had taken hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners throughout the war. The numbers defied explanation, they defied logic, but they were real. And they started with how Major General John Shirley Wood built his division. The 4th Armored Division was activated on April 15, 1941, at Pine Camp in upstate New York, under the command of Brigadier General Henry W. Baird. The division was formed with a cadre of approximately 3,800 men from the 1st Armored Division. Most of the additional men who filled its ranks were draftees from the northeastern United States, farm boys from Pennsylvania, factory workers from New Jersey, college students from Massachusetts who had been pulled from their classrooms 8 months before Pearl Harbor. They knew nothing about tanks. They knew nothing about mobile warfare. They were raw material waiting to be shaped. John Wood shaped them. Wood was born on January 11, 1888, in Monticello, Arkansas. His father, Carroll D. Wood, served as a justice on the Arkansas Supreme Court. The younger Wood graduated from the University of Arkansas in 1907 with a degree in chemistry, completing his studies in just 3 years. He then attended West Point, graduating in 1912. He had served in the First World War. He had attended the École de Guerre in Paris and studied under the French masters of armoured doctrine. He was 54 years old when he took command of the 4th Armoured in May of 1942, which made him ancient by armoured warfare standards. But Wood understood something that younger commanders often missed. He understood that tanks did not win battles. Men won battles. Tanks were just tools. The question was whether the men using those tools had been trained to think faster than their enemies. Wood spent 2 full years training the 4th Armored Division before it ever saw combat. 2 years. Most divisions got 6 months, some got less. Wood demanded more time, fought for more time, and got it. He began at Pine Camp, where the New York winters tested equipment and froze men to their vehicles, he moved the division to Camp Forest in Tennessee for the first Corps maneuvers in October 1942, where his tankers learned to operate in rolling hills and dense forests. Then came the Desert Training Center at Camp Ibis in California, where the 4th Armored became the first armored division to train there. Temperatures reached 120 degrees and sand-clogged engines within hours. The California desert was brutal. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Vehicles broke down constantly. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of empty wasteland. Wood considered it perfect training. He pushed his men to their limits. He made tank crews conduct maintenance in the scorching heat, then immediately launch mock attacks against prepared positions. He ran night exercises where units had to navigate by compass through terrain that looked the same in every direction. He staged ambushes without warning and criticized any commander who failed to. Post adequate security. He trained them in the swamps of Louisiana during the Third Army maneuvers. He made them march until their feet bled, then made them march farther. He ran exercises that lasted 48 hours without sleep. He simulated German tactics, German weapons, German thinking. Veterans later recalled those Louisiana exercises with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. They did not understand at the time why Wood was so hard on them. Then they got to France, and they understood. Everything the Germans did, they had already seen in training. Nothing surprised them. They knew how to handle it. Wood studied German doctrine obsessively. He read captured manuals. He interviewed officers who had observed German operations in Poland and France. He learned how German panzer divisions coordinated their attacks, how they exploited breakthroughs, how they maintained momentum. Then he trained his men to do it better. The key, Wood believed, was combined arms coordination. Tanks alone were vulnerable. Infantry alone was slow. Artillery alone could not hold ground. But tanks, infantry, and artillery working together, supporting each other, covering each other's weaknesses, that combination was unstoppable. He organized his division into combat commands, each built around a tank battalion, an armored infantry battalion, and an artillery battalion. Each combat command was a self-contained fighting force capable of independent operations. They could split up to attack multiple objectives simultaneously or combine for concentrated assaults. The commanders of these combat commands became some of the most capable officers in the American Army. Brigadier General Holmes Dager led Combat Command, B. Colonel Bruce Clark led Combat Command A through the summer and fall of 1944, commanding during the critical Battle of Arracourt. Clark would transfer to the 7th Armored Division on November 1, 1944, where he earned fame defending St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge. Brigadier General Herbert L. Ernest took command of Combat Command A in December and would lead it during the relief of Bastogne. All three would rise to general officer rank after the war. All would credit Wood with teaching them everything they knew about armored warfare, and Wood taught them one principle above all others: speed and aggression. Never stop moving. Never give the enemy time to set his defenses. Hit him before he knows you are coming. Hit him again before he recovers. Keep hitting him until he breaks. Wood drilled this into every man in the division, from tank commanders down to cooks and clerks. Everyone learned to shoot. Everyone learned to maintain vehicles. Everyone learned that their job was to move forward, always forward, never backward, never stopping until the enemy was destroyed. The men started calling their commander Tiger Jack, partly because of his aggressive tactics, partly because when General George Patton yelled at him during planning sessions, Wood would pace back and forth like a caged tiger, growling under his breath. His fellow officers also called him P, short for Professor, because he had tutored struggling classmates at West Point. Wood refused to give the division an official nickname. When staff officers asked what they should call themselves, Wood answered simply, "4th Armored Division was name enough. They shall be known by their deeds alone." The division would eventually be called the Breakthrough Division in 1954, though that name was later discontinued. But during the war and for decades after, veterans simply called it Name Enough, a reference to Wood's original statement. On July 11, 1944, the 4th Armored Division landed on Utah Beach in Normandy. They had crossed the Atlantic in convoy, trained for another 6 months in England, and now they were finally going into combat. The crossing had been uneventful but tense. German submarines still prowled the Atlantic, though their numbers had dwindled. The men spent 13 days at sea, sleeping in cramped holds, playing cards, writing letters they hoped would not be their last. England was a staging area. The division practiced amphibious landings on British beaches, calibrated their weapons and drew equipment. They received the latest model Sherman tanks, the M4A3 with the 76mm gun, a significant improvement over earlier variants. They also received briefings on what awaited them in France. The briefings did not prepare them for reality. Most of the men were terrified. The hedgerows of Normandy had already consumed thousands of American lives. German defenders used the dense bocage to set ambushes, to channel advancing forces into kill zones, to turn every field into a death trap. American infantry divisions were taking massive casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The 4th Armored Division moved into the line on July 15th. Their first combat came 2 days later, near the town of Perriers. It was a probing attack, meant to test German defences and identify weak points. The attack at Perriers was costly. The division lost 14 tanks and over 100 men in 2 days of fighting. But they learned. They learned how German anti-tank guns were positioned. They learned how infantry supported the guns. They learned where the weaknesses were. More importantly, they learned that their training worked. Units that came under fire responded instantly without waiting for orders. Tank crews that lost their vehicles grabbed rifles and fought as infantry. Medics ran forward under fire to treat the wounded. Everything Wood had taught them came together. The 4th Armoured entered combat on July 17th. Within 11 days they had broken through the German lines. Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy, began on July 25. The plan called for massive aerial bombardment to shatter German defences, followed by armoured thrusts through the gaps. The 4th Armoured Division was assigned to spearhead the advance through one of these gaps. The bombing began at 9:40 in the morning. Over 1,500 heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on a narrow strip of German positions. Some of the bombs fell short, killing over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the European theatre. But the effect on the Germans was devastating. Entire units ceased to exist. Survivors stumbled through the craters in shock, unable to offer organized resistance. When the 4th Armoured advanced that afternoon, they found German soldiers wandering aimlessly, too stunned to fight or surrender. General Patton, whose 3rd Army had just become operational, gave Wood a simple order: go as fast as you can, as far as you can, until somebody stops you. Nobody stopped them. The next 2 weeks redefined what armoured warfare could accomplish. The 4th Armoured Division did not advance in a continuous line. They launched multiple thrusts simultaneously, keeping the Germans guessing about their main objective. Combat Command A might be racing toward one town, while Combat Command B swung around to cut the road behind it. The division swept south to take Nantes, cutting off the Brittany Peninsula on August 12, 1944. They trapped 40,000 Germans at Brest. Then they wheeled east and raced across France north of the Loire River, while German commanders tried desperately to figure out where they would strike next. They smashed across the Moselle River between September 11 and 13, flanked the city of Nancy, and captured Luneville on September 16th. The speed of the advance stunned both the Germans and the Allied High Command. The logistical challenges were immense. Supply trucks could not keep up with the advancing tanks. Fuel ran out. Constantly. Wood ordered his men to capture German supply dumps intact whenever possible, and they often ran their vehicles on captured fuel. When they could not find fuel, they simply stopped, refueled from whatever arrived, and started again. The speed was devastating. German units would receive reports of American tanks approaching from the west, only to be hit from the south an hour later. Supply columns were overrun before they could unload their cargo. Command posts were captured with maps still spread on the tables and coffee still warm in the cups. One captured German officer, a colonel from the 352nd Infantry Division, expressed his frustration to American interrogators. "We could not understand how you moved so fast. Our doctrine said that armored divisions needed days to reposition for new attacks. Your division did it in hours. By the time we established a defensive line, you were already behind us." The secret was not just speed, it was coordination. Wood had trained his men to operate as a single organism, with tank battalions, armored infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance all moving together in perfect synchronization. When one unit hit resistance, others maneuvered around it. When an opportunity appeared, everyone exploited it simultaneously. The division developed its own communication shortcuts, its own tactical language, its own instincts. Tank commanders learned to read the movement of friendly vehicles and adjust their own positions without waiting for orders. Artillery forward observers rode in the lead tanks and called in fire missions while still under enemy fire. Engineers cleared obstacles and repaired bridges so fast that the advance never slowed, and through it all, Wood was there. Not in a headquarters miles behind the lines, but in a light L-4 Piper Cub aircraft flown by his personal pilot, Major Charles Carpenter. Wood would fly over his advancing columns, spot German positions and land directly next to his. Forward commanders to deliver orders in person. Carpenter became famous in his own right. He had mounted 6 M101 bazooka rocket tubes on the wings of his tiny observation plane, which he called Rosie the Rocketer. When he spotted German armor, he would dive on it and fire. The Germans called him the Mad Major. His fellow Americans called him Bazooka Charlie. By the end of the war, he was officially credited with destroying 6 German tanks from his flimsy little aircraft. On September 18, 1944, the 4th Armored Division faced its greatest test. The advance across France had finally stalled, not because of German resistance, but because of logistics. The Allied supply lines stretched all the way back to the Normandy beaches over 400 miles away. Fuel that should have gone to Patton's Third Army was being diverted to other operations, including Field Marshal Montgomery's attempt to capture the bridges in the Netherlands. The 4th Armoured had stopped at the Moselle River in the Lorraine region of eastern France. They had established bridgeheads and pushed forward toward Nancy, but they could not sustain a full-scale offensive. They were waiting for supplies that might never come. The Germans saw an opportunity. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, launched a massive counterattack near the town of Arracourt. Von Manteuffel had taken command of 5th Panzer Army on September 1, 1944. The Germans had been secretly assembling forces for weeks. They had brought in 2 new panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped with the latest Panther tanks straight from the factories. They added elements of the veteran 11th Panzer Division and assembled 262 tanks and assault guns in total. Their objective was to destroy the American bridgehead and push the 4th Armoured back across the Moselle. Hitler himself had ordered the attack. He was convinced that a decisive victory in Lorraine could stabilize the Western Front and give Germany time to prepare new defenses. The 4th Armoured Division had 163 tanks. They were outnumbered nearly 2-1. The German Panthers had heavier armor and more powerful guns than the American Shermans. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at 2,000 yards. The Sherman's gun needed to be within 500 yards to have a reasonable chance of penetrating a Panther. On paper, the battle should have been a German victory. It was not. The first German attack came on the morning of September 19th. Heavy fog blanketed the battlefield, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. The Germans advanced in multiple columns, expecting to overwhelm the thin American defenses. They ran into prepared positions manned by men who had spent 2 years learning exactly this kind of fighting. Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division held the area around Arracourt. Colonel Bruce Clark, its commander, had positioned his tanks in hull-down positions, with only their turrets visible above the ridge lines. His infantry dug in around the tanks, covering the approaches with machine guns and bazookas. His artillery registered on likely avenues of German advance. When the first German tanks emerged from the fog, Clark's gunners were waiting. The Battle of Arracourt lasted 11 days. When it ended, the Germans had lost 200 of their 262 armoured vehicles to a combination of combat losses and mechanical breakdowns. The 4th Armored Division had lost 48 tanks across all of September. The Americans won because of training, because of tactics, because of the principles that Wood had drilled into his men for 2 years before they ever saw combat. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion during the battle. He had taken over the unit in September 19th. 43. He was 29 years old, from Springfield, Massachusetts, and had graduated from West Point in 1936, ranking 185th out of 276 cadets. Abrams was not an impressive physical specimen. He was stocky, with a square face and thinning hair. He smoked cigars constantly and spoke in a flat New England accent. He did not look like a hero, but he led like one. Abrams led from the front. He named his Sherman tank Thunderbolt and painted the name in large white letters on the turret so his men could always see where he was. He believed that a commander's place was at the point of maximum danger, where his presence could inspire his men and where he could see the battlefield clearly. This was dangerous. Tank commanders who exposed themselves were vulnerable to snipers, artillery, and small arms fire. Several of Abrams's contemporaries were killed or wounded leading from exposed positions. Abrams accepted the risk because he believed the benefits outweighed the costs. By the end of the war, he would go through 7 Thunderbolts. None of them was ever destroyed by enemy fire while he was inside. Abrams always got out before that happened. His tank might be disabled, burning, or about to explode, but Abrams was already rallying another crew, commandeering another vehicle, getting back into the fight. At Arracourt, Abrams understood that the fog and rain that covered the battlefield neutralized the Germans' greatest advantage. The Panthers had superior guns that could destroy Shermans at 2,000 yards, but in the fog, visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. At that range, the Sherman's 75mm gun was just as deadly as the Panther's 75. Abrams worked closely with Major Harold Cohen, who commanded the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion. The two men developed an extraordinary partnership, with Cohen's infantry and Abrams' tanks operating in perfect coordination. This tank infantry teamwork became a model for the entire division. Abrams positioned his tanks in hull-down positions behind ridges and in tree lines. He let the Germans come to him. When they appeared out of the fog, his gunners were already sighted in, already waiting. Corporal John Gutowski was the gunner on Abrams's own tank Thunderbolt. Nobody knew exactly how many German tanks Gutowski destroyed during the war, but everyone agreed it was more than any other gunner in the division. At Arracourt, he knocked out tank after tank as German formations stumbled into American ambushes. On September 20th, the Germans launched their heaviest attack. A company of Panthers advanced toward the 4th Armored's headquarters at Arracourt. 2 of Abrams' tank companies were outflanked and disorganized by the assault. Abrams did not wait for reinforcements. He counterattacked with his command tank alone. His citation for the Distinguished Service Cross describes what happened next. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams unhesitatingly attacked the enemy force with his command tank, striking with such ferocity that the enemy was thrown into a state of confusion and his own forces were able to regroup. He then led his reorganized companies in a frontal assault which resulted in the complete rout of the enemy. The Battle of Arracourt broke the back of the German counter-offensive in Lorraine. More importantly, it proved that American tank crews, properly trained and properly led, could defeat German armor even when outnumbered and outgunned. The 4th Armored Division claimed 281 German tanks destroyed during the Lorraine campaign. They killed approximately 3,000 Germans and captured 3,000 more. They also fought and defeated several German Panzergrenadier brigades in the Lorraine area, including SS Panzergrenadier Brigade 49 and SS Panzergrenadier Brigade 51. The division's own losses were comparatively light. The secret was not magic. It was not luck. It was the culture that Wood had built and that commanders like Abrams maintained. The 4th Armored Division did not leave wounded men behind. They did not abandon broken-down vehicles. They did not let stragglers fall into enemy hands. When a tank was disabled, other tanks covered its crew while they escaped. When infantry was pinned down, armor came forward to break the enemy position. When anyone was in trouble, everyone responded. This was not standard army practice. Many divisions accepted that some men would be captured. It was an inevitable cost of war. Prisoners of war were an administrative problem, not a tactical concern. You did your best to avoid losing men, but sometimes it happened. Wood refused to accept this logic. He made rescue operations a priority. He trained his men to react instantly when comrades were in danger. He created a culture where every soldier knew, without any doubt, that his brothers would come for him. The division also moved so fast that the Germans rarely had time to evacuate prisoners. When American tanks overran German positions, any prisoners the Germans had taken were often liberated before they could be moved to the rear. Speed protected men in ways that static warfare never could. German intelligence reports from late 1944 mention the 4th Armored Division repeatedly. They describe it as unusually aggressive, unusually mobile, and unusually difficult to engage decisively. One report notes that prisoners from the division were almost impossible to keep because American units always counterattacked to rescue their men before they could be evacuated. Then came December. Then came the Ardennes. The fall of 1944 had been frustrating for the 4th Armored Division. After the stunning successes of August and September, the advance had ground to a halt. Supply shortages, strengthening German defences, and the terrible weather of a European winter combined to slow everything down. The division spent November and early December in defensive positions along the Saar River, probing German fortifications, conducting limited attacks, waiting for the resources to resume the offensive. After a brief rest following Arracourt, the division returned to combat on November 9th with an attack near Viviers. They cleared Bois de Serres on November 12th, advanced through Dieuze, and crossed the Saar River between November 21st and 22nd to establish a bridgehead. They captured the towns of Singling and Beining before being relieved on December 8th, just 8 days before the German offensive began. Then the Germans attacked. On December 16, 1944, 200,000 German soldiers launched the largest offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. They struck through the Ardennes forest, the same route the Wehrmacht had used to conquer France in 1940. They achieved complete tactical surprise. American units in the path of the attack were overwhelmed. The German plan was ambitious. Hitler believed he could split the Allied armies in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was a desperate gamble, but Germany was desperate. The war was lost unless something dramatic changed. The weather favored the attack. Low clouds and fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow and ice made movement difficult but also concealed German preparations. The Americans had thinned their lines in the Ardennes, believing the terrain was too difficult for major operations. They were wrong. The Germans advanced 50 miles in the first week. They surrounded Bastogne, a critical road junction that controlled movement throughout the region. The 101st Airborne Division rushed into the town as reinforcements, found itself cut off and besieged. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, called an emergency meeting on December 19th. He needed someone to relieve Bastogne. He needed it done fast. George Patton stood up. He told Eisenhower that he could attack within 48 hours. Eisenhower was skeptical. Patton had 6 divisions engaged in combat along the Saar River, facing the opposite direction. To attack toward Bastogne, he would have to disengage those divisions, turn them 90 degrees, and move them over 100 miles through winter conditions. Patton said he could do it. He had already prepared contingency plans for exactly this situation. His staff had war-gamed the possibility of a German offensive through the Ardennes weeks earlier. When Patton left the meeting, he called his headquarters and spoke 2 words: play ball. Within hours, 3 divisions were on the move. The 4th Armored Division led the way. The division raced northwest into Belgium, covering 150 miles in just 19 hours. It was an extraordinary feat of logistics and endurance. Snow covered the roads. Ice made them treacherous. Temperatures dropped below 0. The men had no winter clothing, no heated vehicles, no hot food. They kept moving anyway. Major General Hugh Gaffey had taken command of the 4th Armoured on December 3rd, when Wood was relieved due to exhaustion and conflicts with his corps commander. Gaffey was a different kind of commander than Wood. Less charismatic, more methodical. But he understood what the 4th Armored could do, and he pushed them to do it. Gaffey organized his forces into 3 combat commands for the relief operation. Brigadier General Herbert Ernest commanded Combat Command A, which would make the main effort along the Arlon to Bastogne Road. Brigadier General Holmes Dagger led Combat Command B on the western flank. Colonel Wendell Blanchard commanded Combat Command Reserve, which would ultimately make the breakthrough. By December 20th, the division had reached the southern edge of the German penetration. They attacked immediately. The next 5 days were among the hardest fighting the 4th Armored had ever experienced. German paratroopers of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division defended every village, every crossroads, every bridge. The terrain was terrible for armor. Forests, ravines, and frozen streams channeled the tanks into predictable routes where German anti-tank guns waited. Ernest's combat commander faced brutal resistance at Martelange and Warnach. The Germans had fortified both towns heavily. At Warnach on December 23rd and 24th, the fighting was particularly savage. American infantry and tanks attacked from 3 directions before finally securing the village. The losses on both sides were heavy. Meanwhile, Dagger's Combat Command B pushed north toward Chaumont but was stopped by fierce German counterattacks. The gap between the 2 combat commands grew as Dagger advanced faster than Ernest could break through. The division was stretched dangerously thin. The weather made everything worse. Snow fell constantly. The roads, already narrow and winding, became sheets of ice. Tanks slid off the road and into ditches. Half-tracks lost traction on hills and rolled backward. The cold froze the oil in engines and the grease in gun mechanisms. The German defenders knew what was at stake. If the Americans broke through to Bastogne, the entire Ardennes offensive might collapse. They fought with desperate intensity. At Bigonville, the Germans had fortified every building. Machine guns covered every approach. Anti-tank guns were concealed in barns and behind stone walls. The 37th Tank Battalion attacked on December 22nd and fought for 9 hours before finally securing the village. They lost 4 tanks and over 30 men. At Bernan, the Germans launched a counterattack on Christmas Eve that nearly overran the American position. Abrams called in artillery fire on his own positions to break up the German assault. The shells landed within yards of American foxholes. Several men were wounded by friendly fire, but the German attack was shattered. Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion was at the point of the advance. His men fought through Bigonville on December 22nd. They took Bernan on Christmas Eve. They captured Remoyville on Christmas morning. Christmas Day in the Ardennes was not a day of peace. The men of the 4th Armored woke to artillery barrages and small arms fire. They ate cold rations in their vehicles because there was no time to stop. The chaplain conducted services in the lee of a burned-out German half-track, while mortars exploded 200 yards away. On the morning of December 26th, Abrams stood on that frozen hillside and looked toward Bastogne. His battalion had been in continuous combat for 8 days. They had started with 70 operational tanks. Now they had 21. His men were exhausted, frozen, and running low on ammunition. 5 miles. 5 miles through German lines to reach the paratroopers. Abrams radioed General Gaffey and asked for permission to make a straight run for Bastogne. Forget the flanking maneuvers. Forget the cautious advance. Just blast through whatever was in the way and link up with the 101st. Gaffey gave permission. The breakthrough would come not from Ernest's Combat Command A, which had been stalled at Warnock and Martelange, nor from Dagger's Combat Command B. Instead, Colonel Wendell Blanchard's Combat Command Reserve would make the final push. Blanchard had been fighting on the western flank, first capturing Bigonville, then moving west to counter German threats near Sibret. At 3:15 in the afternoon, artillery from 13 American batteries began pounding the village of Assenois, directly in the path of the advance. Over 600 shells hit the village in less than 10 minutes. Buildings collapsed. Fires started. German soldiers who survived the barrage stumbled through the ruins, deaf and disoriented. The shells landed so close to the American tanks that a friendly half-track was hit and disabled. Shrapnel rattled against the armor of the lead Shermans, but they did not stop. They could not stop. Abrams stuck a cigar in his mouth, climbed into the turret of Thunderbolt and keyed his radio. "We're going into those people now. Let her roll." Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion led the assault under Combat Command Reserve, commanded by Colonel Wendell Blanchard. First Lieutenant Charles Bulge commanded the lead tank, an M4A3E2 jumbo Sherman known as Cobra King. The jumbo variant had extra armor plating that made it nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons from the front. His orders were simple: drive straight through the village. Do not stop for anything. Do not deviate from the road. Get to Bastogne. The lead company had only 9 tanks. They charged through Assenois at high speed, firing at everything that moved. German soldiers scattered. Anti-tank guns were overrun before they could fire. A German officer stepped into the road with a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket and was cut down by machine gun fire before he could aim. The column punched through the village in less than 5 minutes. They emerged on the north side and kept going. Behind them, the armoured infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and began clearing the buildings. The fighting in Assenois would continue for hours, but the tanks were already gone. Half a mile beyond Assenois, Lieutenant Bulge saw foxholes ahead. He could not tell if they were American or German. He ordered his gunner to hold fire and kept advancing. A figure emerged from one of the foxholes, waving. At 4:50 in the afternoon, First Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding Cobra King, reached the defensive perimeter of the 101st Airborne. He linked up with Second Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The two men shook hands beside Bulge's tank. Bulge asked where the general was. Webster pointed toward the center of town. The siege of Bastogne was broken. Abrams received his 2nd Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the relief of Bastogne. His first had been awarded for his solo counterattack at Arracourt on September 20th. Abrams arrived 25 minutes later. He reported to Brigadier General MacAuliffe in person. The two men shook hands in the freezing darkness while German shells exploded around them. MacAuliffe asked what had taken so long. Abrams smiled around his cigar and said they had run into some traffic. Patton sent a message to General Gaffey that night. "The outstanding celerity of your movement and the unremitting, vicious and skillful manner in which you pushed the attack, terminating at the end of 4 days and nights of incessant battle in the relief of Bastogne, constitutes one of the finest chapters in the glorious history of the United States Army." The 4th Armored Division did not stop at Bastogne. They fought for another 5 months across the Rhine, through Germany into Czechoslovakia. The weeks after Bastogne were brutal. German forces launched repeated counterattacks trying to close the corridor to the town. The 4th Armoured held the line, losing men and tanks daily. By the time the German offensive finally collapsed in late January, the division had suffered over 2,000 casualties since entering the Ardennes. But they did not break, they did not retreat. They held until the German strength was exhausted. 6 weeks after Bastogne, the 4th Armoured Division jumped off from Luxembourg City in an eastward plunge. They crossed the Moselle River at Trier, drove south and east to Worms, and reached the Rhine on March 21, 1945. On March 22, elements of Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim and Nierstein, beating Field Marshal Montgomery's much-publicized crossing by nearly a day. Patton was delighted. The 4th Armoured crossed the Great River on March 20th. 4 and 25 over pontoon bridges built by Army engineers under German artillery fire. Advancing all night, they crossed the main river the next day south of Hanau and continued to push on. They seized an intact bridge across the Main, which aided the rapid advance of 7th Army. The division fought off numerous counterattacks by German armour near Hanau before pressing deeper into Germany. Lauterbach fell on March 29th. Kreuzberg across the Werra River fell on April 1st. On April 4, 1945, the 4th Armoured Division, along with elements of the 89th Infantry Division, made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp, the first Nazi camp discovered by American forces. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald concentration camp, established by the SS in November 1944 near the town of Gotha. At its peak in late March 1945, the camp had held approximately 11,700 prisoners. The SS had forced prisoners to construct railway lines and dig large underground caverns inside a nearby mountain, for a communications center that was never completed. Conditions at the worksite were harsh, unsafe, and unhealthy. As the Americans approached, the SS evacuated thousands of prisoners on foot and in trucks to Buchenwald and toward Regensburg. Prisoners too ill to walk were shot by SS guards. Nothing in the soldiers' training had prepared them for what they found. Hundreds of decomposing corpses lay throughout the camp. Some had been partially burned in a hasty attempt to destroy evidence. Survivors were so emaciated they could barely stand. Evidence of torture, medical experiments, and systematic murder defied comprehension. General Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf on April 12, accompanied by Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. The evidence of Nazi atrocities shocked the army leadership. Eisenhower was so affected that he contacted General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and urged him to send congressional delegations and prominent American newspaper editors to tour the newly liberated camps. Eisenhower wanted as many witnesses as possible to see the evidence firsthand. He ordered every American soldier in the area to tour the camp so they could bear witness. He wanted them to understand what they were fighting against. The 4th Armored Division's discovery of Ohrdruf opened the eyes of many American soldiers to the horrors committed during the Holocaust. The 4th Armored pressed on. By April 12 they had crossed the Saale River. They liberated prisoner-of-war camps holding American and British soldiers captured earlier in the war. They freed slave laborers from factories. They accepted the surrender of entire German divisions that preferred American captivity to the approaching Soviet army. On May 6th, the division crossed into Czechoslovakia. They established a bridgehead across the Otara River at Strakonice and pushed forward elements to Písek. The 4th Armored had been driving toward Prague when the German surrender came. 2 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the 4th Armored Division had been in combat for 230 days. They had advanced farther than any other division in the European theatre. They had destroyed or captured 579 German tanks, 3,668 other vehicles, 603 artillery pieces, and 103 locomotives. They had taken 90,354 prisoners. And according to official army records, only one of their own men remained in German captivity when the war ended. Veterans of the division discussed this statistic for decades after the war. The records note a small number of soldiers were temporarily captured during combat, but the division's culture of immediate counterattack meant they were almost always rescued before being evacuated. The official count of 1 represents soldiers who remained prisoners, not the total ever taken. But even accounting for temporary captures, the ratio remained extraordinary. John Wood did not live to see the end of the war with the 4th Armored. He had been relieved of command on December 3, 1944, officially for health reasons, unofficially because he had made too many enemies among his superiors. Wood was difficult. He argued with his corps commanders. He criticized decisions made above his pay grade. He told more than one superior officer that they were winning the war the wrong way. In August 1944, when he was ordered to besiege the port of Brest instead of continuing his eastward drive, he complained openly that the decision was strategically foolish. He was right about Brest. The port was never used by the Allies. The resources devoted to its capture could have been better employed elsewhere. But being right did not make Wood easier to work with. He returned to the United States and finished the war commanding a training center at Fort Knox. It was an important job preparing new armored units for combat, but it was not the same as leading men in battle. After the war, Wood worked for the United Nations, helping refugees in Austria and Korea. He supervised the resettlement of over 1 million displaced persons from the chaos of post-war Europe. He applied the same organizational skills he had used building the 4th Armored to the task of rebuilding shattered lives. He never received another combat command. He died on July 2, 1966, in Reno, Nevada, at the age of 78. After Wood's departure, the 4th Armored was commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey through the Battle of the Bulge. Brigadier General William M. Hogue took command in March 1945 and was promoted to Major General. Before the war's end, Major General Fay B. Prickett commanded during the occupation period. The British military historian Basil Liddell Hart called Wood the Rommel of the American armored forces and one of the most dynamic commanders of armor in World War II. Lieutenant General Willis Krittenberger, who had worked with Wood throughout the war, said he far exceeded in his leadership capabilities any man I have ever known. Creighton Abrams became one of the most important soldiers of the 20th century. After the war, he commanded tank units in Germany during the Cold War, facing the Soviet threat that followed the Allied victory. He served in Korea. He commanded the 3rd Armored Division during the Berlin crisis of 1961. In 1968, he took command of all American forces in Vietnam. He oversaw the transition from search and destroy operations to Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. He managed the American withdrawal with professionalism that preserved as much of the Army's honor as possible in an impossible situation. He became Army Chief of Staff in 1972. He oversaw the transition from a conscript army to an all-volunteer force. He reformed training, doctrine, and equipment. He laid the groundwork for the army that would win the Gulf War 2 decades later. He died of lung cancer on September 4, 1974, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, just short of his 60th birthday. President Gerald Ford attended his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. The M1 Abrams main battle tank, the backbone of American armored forces for 4 decades, is named after him. Every soldier who drives that tank carries a piece of Creighton Abrams with them. The men of the 4th Armored scattered after the war. The division returned to the United States on April 25, 1946, and was inactivated the following day, though some elements remained in. Germany as occupation forces after redesignation as constabulary units. The veterans went home to Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Massachusetts and all the other places they had come from. They married, raised families, built careers. They did not talk much about what they had done, but they stayed connected. The 4th Armored Division Association held reunions every year until the last veterans became too old to travel. They shared memories, told stories, remembered the friends they had lost. Perhaps the most important legacy of the 4th Armored Division is not a weapon or a document. It is a principle. The division proved that training matters more than technology, that leadership matters more than numbers, that soldiers who trust each other, who know their commanders will never abandon them, will fight harder and smarter than soldiers who doubt. The 4th Armored did not have better tanks than other American divisions. They had the same Shermans, the same half-tracks, the same artillery. They did not have more men or more supplies. They had the same allocations as everyone else. What they had was 2 years of training under a commander who refused to accept mediocrity. What they had was a culture that valued every soldier's life and proved it in action. What they had was the knowledge that they were the best, not because anyone told them so, but because they had earned it through sweat and discipline and sacrifice. Military historians have studied the 4th Armored Division for decades trying to understand what made them different. They have analyzed the tactics, the equipment, the terrain. They have interviewed veterans and examined records. They have written books and articles and doctoral dissertations. The conclusion is always the same. The difference was not in the tanks. The difference was in the men. John Wood understood something that many commanders never learn. An army is not a machine. It is an organism. It has spirit and morale and culture. Those intangible factors matter more than firepower or armor thickness. A division that believes in itself, that trusts its leaders, that knows it will never be abandoned, can accomplish things that seem impossible. They shall be known by their deeds alone. Wood said those words in 1942, when the division was nothing but raw recruits and borrowed equipment. He could not have known then what those deeds would be. He could not have imagined the drive across France, the stand at Arracourt, the relief of Bastogne, the final push into Germany. But he knew what he was building. He knew that if he trained them right, if he led them right, they would become something extraordinary. He was right. The 4th Armored Division earned 13 campaign streamers, 2 presidential unit citations, and the French Croix de Guerre, with Palm for actions in both Normandy and the Moselle River campaign. The division was the first American armored division to receive the Presidential Unit Citation. They also received the French Fourragère in the colors of the Croix de Guerre. Individual soldiers earned 34 Distinguished Service Crosses, over 800 Silver Stars, and more than 3,000 Bronze Stars. They produced more than a dozen general officers and countless other distinguished soldiers. They set records that still stand and established standards that other units still try to match. 32 soldiers of the 4th Armored Division remain listed as missing in action to this day, a reminder that even the most successful units paid a heavy price for victory. That is what training can do. That is what leadership can do. That is what a band of brothers, bound together by shared sacrifice and absolute trust, can accomplish when everything is on the line. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like,